At first, Peter thought the gorilla was going to attack him. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for two cars to pass each other without slowing down. Trees pressed close on both sides, and the afternoon light came through in broken pieces. Peter had driven this stretch dozens of times, a rural connector road running along the edge of a forest reserve in Uganda. Quiet, usually. Predictable. Not today. Cars had already stopped behind him. He could see them in his mirror. Doors half open, people frozen between getting out and staying in. Nobody was moving forward, and when Peter looked through his windshield to find the reason, his stomach dropped. In front of his car stood a massive silverback gorilla, not at a distance, not disappearing into the tree line. Right there, 10 feet from his hood, close enough that Peter could see the gray across his back catching the light, could see the width of his chest, the sheer weight of him. But the gorilla wasn't charging. He wasn't beating his chest. He wasn't screaming. He was standing close to Peter's door, turned slightly sideways, and staring at him with dark, steady eyes. Not the vacant stare of a confused animal that wandered too close to a road. Something else, something focused, like he was waiting for Peter to understand something. Peter didn't move. He knew better. Every instinct in him said, don't reach for the door, don't reveeds the engine, don't make a sound that could be read as a threat. He pressed himself back in his seat and kept his hands visible on the wheel. Behind him someone honked once, short and nervous. The gorilla's head turned toward the sound immediately, shoulders rising, and Peter felt his breath catch. Don't, please don't. The honking stopped. The gorilla turned back to Peter, and then something strange happened. The gorilla looked away from him, not down the road, not at the crowd forming behind the stopped cars. He looked toward the right side of the road, toward a patch of dense brush and overgrown grass that ran along a shallow drainage ditch. He held his gaze there for a moment, maybe two, then he looked back at Peter. Peter didn't know what to make of it. Wild animals near roads were not unheard of in this region. Occasional crossings, rare sightings. But a silverback standing still beside a car, watching a human's face, was not a crossing. This was something else entirely. Then the gorilla stepped away from the car. Peter exhaled, but the gorilla didn't leave. He moved 3 or 4 steps toward the brush, stopped and turned around. His eyes found Peter again through the windshield. He stood there, waiting. The movement wasn't random. It wasn't the pacing of an agitated animal trying to decide whether to flee or fight. It was deliberate, back and forth. The gorilla looked toward the brush, looked at Peter, moved toward it, returned. Again, a pattern that made no sense, and yet felt, somehow, like it had a direction. Then the gorilla raised one huge hand and pressed it flat against the side of Peter's car. Not a strike, not aggression, just pressure, a pause, and in that pause Peter heard something. A sound from the brush, small, weak, almost swallowed entirely by the noise of idling engines and the low murmur of frightened people standing too far away to help and too close to leave. It lasted only a second, then silence. The gorilla turned toward it immediately. Every muscle in his body shifted at once. Weight forward, attention absolute, and in that single movement, Peter understood something had changed. The gorilla wasn't confused. He wasn't lost. He wasn't threatening the road out of territorial instinct. He was asking for something. Peter slowly reached for his phone. The crowd behind him had grown louder. He could hear voices now, urgent and overlapping, people telling each other to back up, someone shouting at a child to stay inside the car. The noise was rising, and the gorilla's eyes kept moving between Peter and the brush and the crowd, tracking all of it at once, calculating something Peter couldn't name. He dialed wildlife rescue and pressed the phone to his ear. The dispatcher answered on the second ring. Peter spoke quietly, evenly, the way you talk when you know that volume matters. He described the road, his location, the animal standing outside his window. He described the behavior, the back and forth movement, the sound from the brush. The dispatcher told him to stay in the car, keep the engine off, and wait. A team was close, maybe 15 minutes. 15 minutes felt like a long time. The gorilla turned back toward the roadside brush, and the sound came again, weak, faint, barely there. But this time Peter was watching the brush line when it happened, and that was when he saw it. Just for a moment, just long enough to be certain. A tiny hand, no bigger than a child's, reached up from beneath the leaves at the edge of the ditch, trembled once in the air, and fell back down. Peter stopped breathing for a moment. He had seen it clearly. Small fingers, dark skin, the unmistakable shape of a hand that was not human, but was close enough to make something inside him go very quiet. He looked at the gorilla. The silverback was already facing the brush, his back to the road, his body angled like a wall between the ditch and everything else on that road. He wasn't blocking traffic. He was standing guard. Peter kept the phone pressed to his ear and told the dispatcher what he had just seen. A baby, hidden near the ditch, possibly injured. The dispatcher's tone shifted immediately. She told him not to approach, not to open the door, and to describe the silverback's current behavior as precisely as he could. Peter did. Calm but tense, he said, not charging, positioned between the crowd and the brush, watching everything. She said the team was moving faster now. Behind Peter, the crowd had no idea what was in that ditch. They saw a massive wild animal blocking a road, and they filled in the rest with fear. Phones were raised. People called out to each other. A man near the back of the line had climbed onto the roof of his car to get a better view, and the added height made him louder, more visible, more disruptive than he understood. The gorilla's head swung toward him twice in 30 seconds. Peter lowered his window by 2 inches and said, as firmly as he could without raising his voice, that everyone needed to step back and stay quiet. A few people nearest to him heard it. Some of them listened. Most of the crowd didn't even know where the voice had come from. The noise continued. The silverback's shoulders lifted higher. This was the part that scared Peter more than the animal itself. Not the gorilla, the people. A crowd that doesn't understand what it's looking at is unpredictable in ways a wild animal never is. The gorilla was responding to real things. The crowd was responding to fear and curiosity, and the pull of a camera lens. Those are harder forces to manage. And if something startled that silverback badly enough, the road would turn dangerous in seconds. Peter said nothing more. He just waited and watched and kept his movements invisible. The wildlife response vehicle arrived 11 minutes later, not 15. It came from the opposite end of the road, which meant it didn't have to push through the crowd behind Peter. 2 officers stepped out slowly. No rushing, no doors slamming. They moved the way people move when they have done this before, and understand that everything depends on the first 30 seconds of presence. The taller officer raised one hand toward the gathered crowd, and simply pointed back. No words. The gesture was clear enough. People shifted. Not completely, but enough to reduce the noise by half. The second officer spoke briefly into a radio, then moved to the edge of the road and crouched low, scanning the brush line without advancing. Peter watched the silverback watch them. The gorilla hadn't moved from his position near the ditch, but his attention had shifted fully to the 2 officers now. He was reading them the same way he had been reading Peter, measuring, waiting for a reason to react. The taller officer moved slowly toward Peter's car and spoke through the cracked window in a low, even voice. He said his name was Marcus. He asked Peter to describe everything he had seen from the beginning, in order, quietly. Peter did. When he mentioned the tiny hand in the brush, Marcus nodded once and said he had already suspected as much. He explained it quickly and without drama. Young gorillas occasionally follow adults too close to road edges, especially in areas where the forest boundary has shifted due to clearing. The ditch alongside this road was steep-sided and narrow, easier to fall into than to climb out of. If the baby had slipped or been pushed by underbrush while crossing, and if something had caught its leg on the way down, the silverback would have been trapped in an impossible situation, strong enough to tear a tree from the ground, completely helpless against something tangled and small. Peter looked at the gorilla again with that thought in his mind, and felt something shift in his chest. Marcus told him to stay where he was and keep doing exactly what he had been doing. Still, quiet, present, without being threatening. He said the gorilla had chosen this car and this spot for a reason, and disrupting that now would cost them time they didn't have. The second officer, a younger woman named Adayasi, had already begun moving the crowd further back, not aggressively, calmly and firmly, one cluster of people at a time, explaining in short sentences that the animal was protecting an injured infant and that noise was the most dangerous thing on that road right now. Some people understood immediately and moved. Others needed a second ask. A few pulled their phones down on their own once they processed what she was saying. The road got quieter. The silverback noticed. His breathing was still heavy, his posture still high and tense, but the constant scanning slowed slightly. He looked at Marcus. He looked back at the brush. He made a low sound that wasn't a roar and wasn't a call, something between a warning and a question. Marcus began moving toward the ditch. Slow steps. Weight shifted carefully. Eyes down and to the side, not locked on the gorilla directly, because direct eye contact at close range reads as challenge. He had done this before. His body knew the language even when the situation was new. The silverback stepped forward. Marcus stopped. Everyone on that road went completely still. Then Peter did the only thing he could think of. He spoke, not loudly, not with any particular words that mattered. Just a low, steady stream of sound through the cracked window, the way you talk to something frightened when you have nothing useful left to offer except presence. The gorilla's eyes moved to him. Marcus took one more step. The silverback held his ground but didn't charge. That half second of stillness was enough. Marcus reached the edge of the ditch and looked down. He turned back toward Adausi with an expression that confirmed everything. Then he reached for the small radio on his shoulder and said 2 words. "Wire trap." And just as the words left his mouth, the baby cried out from inside the ditch, sharp and desperate, and the silverback rushed forward so fast the crowd behind Peter erupted into screaming. The silverback didn't reach Marcus. He stopped just short of him, close enough that Marcus could have touched him if he'd been foolish enough to try. But Marcus didn't move. He didn't flinch back, didn't raise his hands, didn't make a sound. He just went completely still and let the gorilla fill the space around him without giving him a reason to fill it with force. The crowd behind Peter was still loud. Someone was crying. Someone else was shouting directions that made no sense from that distance. Adausi turned and moved back toward them immediately, arms out, voice low and sharp, cutting through the noise with the kind of authority that doesn't ask for permission. The screaming dropped within seconds. Not silence, but close enough. The silverback stood over the ditch. He looked down at the baby, then at Marcus, then back down. His breathing came in long, audible pulls. His hands opened and closed against the ground. This was not aggression building toward a charge. This was something harder to watch. This was an animal at the absolute edge of what he could manage, holding himself together by the thinnest possible thread. Marcus backed away 2 full steps without turning around. He kept his eyes low and his hands visible, and he moved slowly enough that each step announced itself before it landed. The silverback watched every inch of it. When Marcus stopped, the gorilla looked at him for a long moment, then looked down into the ditch again. He reached one enormous hand toward the baby, gently, the gentleness startling given his size, and made a soft sound. The baby answered, weak, tired, but alive. Peter let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Marcus moved to the rear of the response vehicle and came back with a folded rescue blanket and a pair of heavy wire cutters. He showed them to Adausi without speaking. She nodded. They had done versions of this before, though never quite this. Every situation with a protective adult and a trapped juvenile was its own specific problem. The variable that mattered most was always the same. How much trust could you build in the time you actually had? They didn't have much. Marcus set the blanket on the ground near the edge of the ditch, unfolded it slowly and left it there. He stepped back. He wasn't offering it to anyone. He was just making it visible, part of the landscape, something that existed without threat. It was a small thing. It mattered. The baby shifted inside the ditch. The movement must have pulled against whatever was caught around the leg, because the cry that followed was sharper than the ones before. Higher. The silverback's whole body reacted. He swung toward the ditch and made a sound that rolled across the road like a physical thing, low and resonant and full of something that had no clean translation but needed none. Peter gripped the steering wheel. Marcus crouched low and spoke to Adausi in a voice too quiet for Peter to catch. She moved to the far side of the ditch opposite the silverback, and crouched as well. The angle mattered. They needed to approach the baby from a direction that didn't put them directly between the silverback and his infant. Coming in from the side, low to the ground, moving in parallel rather than toward him, changed the read of the situation just enough. The silverback watched Adausi. She didn't look at him directly. She looked at the ditch, at the baby. She made no sudden moves. She let the silence work. The baby reached weakly toward the blanket. That small movement, one thin arm extending out of the leaves toward something soft on the ground above, was enough to shift the entire weight of the moment. The silverback saw it. His posture changed by degrees, shoulders dropping a fraction, jaw loosening slightly. He was still close, still watchful, but the arm reaching upward told him something that no human on that road could have communicated in words. The baby wanted help. Marcus moved in from his side with the wire cutters held low against his leg. Not hidden, just low, unthreatening in shape and angle. He reached the edge of the ditch and looked down carefully. The wire was not a poacher's trap, not deliberately set. It was old fencing debris, the kind that accumulates at forest road boundaries over years, half buried and forgotten until something living finds it the wrong way. A short coil of rusted wire had caught around the baby's left ankle, and the more he had struggled, the more it had tightened. The skin beneath was raw but not deeply torn. The damage was in the trapped position itself, the inability to move, the hours of stress and exhaustion wearing the small body down. Marcus exhaled quietly. Adausi kept her attention on the silverback while Marcus worked. He opened the cutters slowly. The metal made a faint sound as the handles spread. The silverback's head came up immediately, ears forward, every sense locked onto that tool. Marcus paused, waited. The gorilla stared at the cutters for a long moment, then looked at Marcus's face, then back at the cutters. Peter spoke softly from inside the car. He wasn't saying anything specific. There were no magic words for this. He just kept his voice low and even and continuous, a steady human sound that the gorilla had been hearing since the beginning of all this, since the moment he had chosen this car and this man out of everything on the road. It wasn't communication in any technical sense, but it was familiar, and familiar was the only currency they had left. The silverback's eyes moved to Peter's window. Marcus cut the first loop of wire. It gave without much resistance, rusted through in places, and the baby pulled his leg slightly at the sensation of it loosening. The silverback took one step forward and stopped when Marcus went still. The standoff lasted 4 seconds. 5. Then the gorilla made the same low sound as before, quieter this time, and held his position. Marcus cut the second loop. The wire fell away. For a moment nothing happened. The baby lay at the bottom of the ditch, leg free, and simply breathed. The silverback leaned over the edge and made a series of short, soft sounds, urgent and tender at once. The baby's head turned toward the sound. Then slowly the baby began to move. He pulled himself upward, one arm at a time, using the blanket's edge where it draped over the ditch wall as something to hold. His movements were slow and unsteady, the leg that had been trapped dragging slightly as he climbed, but he was climbing, on his own, with whatever strength he had left. The silverback reached down, and for one suspended second, as the baby's small hand found the big one, the whole road was absolutely silent. Then the baby's grip slipped. His arms gave out entirely. He dropped back into the ditch and didn't move again. The silverback made a sound that Peter would not forget for the rest of his life. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't the chest-beating display that people associate with gorillas in wildlife documentaries. It was something lower than that, and more broken, a sound that came from somewhere deeper than threat or territory or fear. It lasted only a moment. Then the gorilla went completely still, leaning over the edge of the ditch, staring down at the baby who had stopped moving. Marcus was already moving. There was no more time for careful degrees of approach. The baby had gone limp, and that changed the calculation entirely. Marcus went to the edge of the ditch in 3 quick steps, and the silverback swung toward him fast, all that weight shifting in an instant. Marcus stopped and held both hands open at his sides, palms out, nothing in them. He didn't back away this time. He stayed exactly where he was and let the gorilla read him at close range. Whatever the silverback saw, it was enough. He didn't move forward. Marcus dropped into the ditch. It was shallow enough that his head and shoulders stayed visible above the edge. He reached the baby in seconds and put 2 fingers gently against the small chest. He looked up at a daze. The baby was breathing, shallow and fast, the breathing of exhaustion rather than injury, but breathing. She passed him the field kit without a word, and he opened it with practiced hands, working quickly and quietly while the silverback watched from above with an intensity that made the air feel thin. Peter watched all of it through his windshield and felt completely useless in a way that was almost unbearable. He kept talking anyway, low and steady through the cracked window, the same thing he had been doing since Marcus first approached because it was the only thing he had to offer, and the gorilla was still glancing at him between long stares into the ditch. Peter didn't know if it helped. He suspected it helped more than he would ever be able to measure. Sometimes presence is the whole contribution. A daisy moved to the edge and crouched beside the silverback's space without entering it. She kept her body language loose and her eyes on the middle distance. She spoke quietly to the gorilla the way Marcus had instructed her to in situations like this, not words designed to communicate meaning but a tone designed to communicate safety. Steady, unhurried. "We are not here to take anything from you." Then he sat down. Not fully relaxed, not trusting, but sitting, which was different from the coiled readiness he had been holding for the past hour. His weight settled, and his breathing slowed by a fraction, and a daisy felt the shift the way you feel a storm decide not to break. She didn't react to it visibly. She just let it be what it was. As Marcus worked on the baby with water first, a few careful drops against the lips, then a slow trickle when the baby responded. The small mouth opened instinctively, and Marcus kept the water coming in tiny amounts, watching the throat for the swallow reflex, watching the chest for any change in the breathing pattern. The baby's eyes opened once, dark and glassy, and closed again. But the breathing steadied. But then came the leg. The ankle where the wire had been was swollen and raw, the skin abraded in a band around the joint. Marcus examined it with 2 fingers, pressing lightly at different points, watching the baby's face for pain response. The baby flinched twice but didn't cry out. That was a reasonable sign. Deep tissue damage would have produced a sharper reaction. This was surface injury, painful and serious, but not the kind that threatened the limb. Marcus wrapped it loosely with clean gauze from the kit, enough to protect the skin without restricting circulation. The silverback leaned over the edge of the ditch and looked directly at what Marcus was doing. Marcus didn't stop. He didn't slow down. He finished the wrap with the same steady hands and then sat back and gave the gorilla a clear view of the baby, unobstructed, nothing hidden. "This is what we did. This is what it looks like." The gorilla stared at the wrapped ankle for several seconds. Then he made a short, quiet sound. From inside the ditch, the baby answered. The sound the baby made was thin and tired, but it was immediate and it was directed upward, toward the voice it knew better than any other sound in the world. The silverback's whole body responded to it in a way that was almost painful to watch, not with movement but with something that passed through him visibly, a release of something that had been locked tight for a very long time. He had been holding that tension since before Peter ever arrived on this road. Marcus looked up at a Daisy and gave a small nod. She reached down and he passed the baby up carefully, both hands supporting the small body, the wrapped leg cradled from below. A Daisy received him at the surface and held him low and still while Marcus climbed out of the ditch behind her. The silverback rose to his feet. A Daisy turned her body slightly and lowered the baby toward the ground, not releasing him, just bringing him into the gorilla's line of sight at a level that was easier to approach. She kept her own face turned away. She made herself as small as her size allowed. The baby reached one arm upward toward the silverback and made the sound again, weak but insistent. The silverback stepped forward. He sniffed the baby once, then again. His nose moved along the small face and chest with the careful attention of an animal checking for something wrong, something changed, some unfamiliar trace left behind by handling. He paused at the wrapped ankle, sniffed it, touched it once with one finger, so gently that it seemed impossible from a hand that size. Then he looked at a Daisy. She set the baby down on the ground and took 2 steps back. The silverback gathered the baby against him in a movement that was slow and deliberate and complete. The baby pressed into his chest and made a sound that needed no translation. The silverback stood for a moment with the baby held close, and the road was so quiet that Peter could hear his own heartbeat. Then Marcus began moving the remaining onlookers back, creating a wide, clear path toward the tree line. He did it without urgency, without drama, just opening a corridor between where the gorilla stood and the forest edge 30 meters away. A Daisy radioed ahead to make sure no vehicles were moving on the far side of the road. The silverback didn't wait for an invitation. He turned toward the trees and walked, the baby held securely against his side, moving with the unhurried authority of an animal returning to the only place that made sense. People parted ahead of him without being asked. Something about the way he moved made the question of blocking him feel absurd. Peter watched him go. He was almost at the tree line when he stopped. Not completely, not for long, just a pause, 1 or 2 seconds at most, beside the front corner of Peter's car. Close enough that Peter could see his face clearly through the windshield. The gorilla didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at Marcus or a Daisy. He looked at Peter directly, with the same focused attention he had used at the very beginning, when he had chosen this car out of everything on this road, and pressed one hand against the door and waited to be understood. Peter couldn't speak. The gorilla held his gaze for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then he turned and walked into the trees and the forest took them both. Peter sat in his car for a long time after that. The crowd slowly dissolved. Marcus came to his window and said a few things about the baby's prognosis that were encouraging, something about monitoring from a distance, about the resilience of young gorillas when the injury is caught early. Peter heard the words and nodded, but most of his attention was still somewhere inside those trees. He thought about the hand pressed against his car door, the back and forth movement, the steady eyes that would not let him look away. He thought about what it must have taken for a wild animal, built by every instinct to handle the world alone, to stand at the edge of a road full of noise and strangers and hold his ground and wait for one specific person to understand. The gorilla had never begged like a human. He hadn't needed to, because what Peter had seen in those eyes at the end wasn't gratitude exactly. It wasn't the kind of emotion that comes with words or gestures, or the performance of feeling. It was something quieter and more permanent than that. It was recognition, one creature acknowledging another across every distance between them, saying without language what language could never quite hold. "You saw me," and that was enough.